The reservation is for members and their invited guests. The man who said it was not looking at Elowyn Marsh when he said it. He was looking at his clipboard, and the clipboard was more important than she was, and the 40 or so people standing near the entrance of the Halstead Grand Ballroom on the evening of November the 11th could hear every syllable of it. Elowyn was 43 years old. She was wearing a coat that had been good once, 7 years ago, and black trousers that were pressed but not new, and her hair had been cut by a neighbor's daughter rather than a stylist, and she did not look like the kind of woman who belonged at the 14th annual Halstead County Veterans Association dinner, and the man with the clipboard had decided this before she reached the front of the line. She told him her name. He scrolled his list a second time, unhurrying himself, and then he told her there must have been a registration error and that the organization's coordinator would be reachable by email on Monday. The room filled in around her. Nobody made room for her. A woman in a red blazer moved half a step to the left to keep her champagne glass from being jostled, and a man in a pressed Veterans Association blazer found something worth reading on his phone, and nobody did the thing a person might have done, which was to say, wait. Elowyn put both hands in her coat pockets and stood there in the kind of stillness that comes from a long time of needing to stand still under conditions considerably worse than this. The pocket of her left coat panel held a small object, flat and rectangular, the size of a playing card but heavier, and when her fingers found it, she did not take it out. She only held it. Then she said quietly that she had an invitation, that it had come by post 6 weeks ago, and she gave the name of the person who had sent it. The man with the clipboard said he was sorry, but the list was the list. Behind Elowyn, 3 more people arrived and filed past her on both sides as if she were a traffic obstacle. She did not move and she did not raise her voice. Then, from somewhere in the crowded entrance hall, approximately 8 feet to her left and slightly behind her, a man stopped walking. Not the way a person stops when they nearly collide with someone, the way a person stops when they see something they did not expect to see, in a place they expected to know entirely. He was broad-shouldered, in his mid-60s, in a dark suit with a single small enamel pin on the lapel. His left hand held a glass of water and he did not set it down. He did not speak. He looked at Elowyn Marsh from the side, at the angle of her posture, at her hands in her coat pockets, at something about the set of her shoulders, and his expression did not change into surprise. It changed into recognition. Before you go any further, if you have ever been told the list is the list when you knew perfectly well you were on it, drop "I was there" in the comments and subscribe. The room was about to learn something about what kind of person was standing at that door. It had begun to rain at 3:17 that afternoon, which mattered because Elowyn had walked the 1.4 miles from the parking structure on Fennell Street, where the overnight rate was $6, which was the kind of parking she could afford, and she had arrived at the Halstead Grand with damp shoulders and with 14 minutes to spare before the reception doors opened. She had given herself those 14 minutes because she had learned, over a period of years, to build time into arrivals, not because she was disorganized, because things went wrong in predictable ways for people in her general situation, and she had long since decided that the only answer to predictable friction was to arrive before it could stack up. She was living in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, with her younger sister Dara, and Dara's son, a 5-year-old named Theo, who called Elowyn by her first name, because Dara had raised him to regard her as a person rather than a title. Elowyn had been back in Halstead for 9 months. Before that, she had been in a different city, in a rented room above a laundry, working a logistics coordinator position for a regional freight company that had restructured itself out of existence in January. Before that, for 11 years prior to the freight company, she had been something else entirely. But she did not talk about that in the way some people did not talk about a particular room in a house. The invitation had come, as she said, 6 weeks earlier, addressed to her name, and forwarded twice before it found her. It was on the organization's letterhead, cream stock with a navy border, and it read that Staff Sergeant Elowen Marsh was cordially invited to attend the 14th annual dinner as a recognized veteran of service. It had been signed by a woman named Patricia Villard, events coordinator, and below that signature was a handwritten addition in different pen and different handwriting, 4 words only. The 4 words read, "She should be there." Elowen had read those 4 words several times before she set the invitation on her kitchen counter, and did not pick it up again for 2 days. Then she had called the number on the letterhead and left a message saying she would attend. Nobody had called back. The Halstead Grand Ballroom occupied the 2nd floor of a building that had once been a department store and had been converted in the 1990s into event space and boutique offices. The ceilings were 22 feet high. The chandeliers were not original, but they were convincing. The organization had used the venue for the last 6 years, and by November 11th of this year, the room held 137 people across 15 tables, each set for 10, plus a head table for 8, elevated on a 4-inch platform at the northern end. By the time Elowen reached the ballroom entrance, the room was mostly seated. She could see open seats at 2 tables, one near the back and one near the left side wall. Both had place cards. Neither had her name. She stood at the threshold for a moment, and then a young woman in the organization's blue volunteer lanyard approached her and asked if she could help. Elowen told the young woman her name. The young woman went to check with someone and came back 90 seconds later looking sorry in the way people look when the sorry is genuine, but the correction is beyond their authority. She said there had been some confusion about the registration, and that if Elowen would like to wait, there might be a folding chair available near the volunteer station. The volunteer station was a cloth-covered table against the far wall, with a coffee urn and a tray of cookies and 4 aluminum folding chairs lined up beside it. Not at any of the 15 tables, but at the wall, in the way that furniture is arranged when it is meant to be useful rather than attended. Elowen said she understood. She did not sit down at the volunteer station. She stood near it, at a distance of approximately 6 feet, and she looked at the room the way she had been trained to look at rooms, which was all of it at once, quickly, and then in pieces. The man in the dark suit from the entrance hall was now seated at the head table. His place card faced away from her, but the single enamel pin on his lapel was visible from 30 feet, and she knew what it was. She had known what it was in the entrance hall, too. She simply had not let herself look directly at it, the way a person does not look directly at something that costs them too much to see. The man in the dark suit was Brigadier General Corvin Aldgate, retired, and he was the evening's keynote speaker, and he was watching the room, and he had not stopped watching the section near the volunteer station since he sat down. The dinner had a program, and the program ran as these dinners run, which is to say exactly as planned and not at all as intended. The president of the Halstead County Veterans Association, a man named Dougray Elst, who was 61 years old, who wore a blazer with 4-unit patches and a lapel pin from a golf association, and who had been retired from a desk position for 16 years, and spoke of it with the certainty of someone who has not been tested since, opened the evening with a welcome address that lasted 9 minutes longer than scheduled. He spoke about sacrifice in the general sense, and about community in the general sense, and about the importance of occasions like this one in the general sense, and the room listened with the patience of people who were waiting for their food. Across the course of those 9 minutes, Elowen Marsh stood near the volunteer station and held her coat over her arm and did not shift her weight. One of the volunteers, a young man with a nervous energy about him, offered her coffee twice. She accepted on the second offer. The coffee was in a foam cup and it was hot, and she held it with both hands, and it was the most useful thing anyone had given her since she walked in the door. When Dougray Elst completed his address and returned to his seat at the head table, 3 chairs to the right of Corvin Aldgate. He did not look toward the volunteer station. Corvin Aldgate did. His expression did not change, but something behind it did, and the woman seated next to him at the head table, a retired lieutenant colonel named Fia Sutherland who administered a veterans transition program out of the city's East Campus, noticed the stillness in him and followed his gaze toward the wall and frowned. Fia Sutherland was 55, sharp, and had been in enough rooms with Corvin Aldgate to know that his stillness meant he was calculating something. She turned back to her salad and said nothing and waited. The first course arrived, and the room filled with silverware sounds and conversation, and at the volunteer station Elowen Marsh set her foam cup down on the cloth table and looked at the one object in the room she had been not quite looking at since she arrived. There was a chair, not a folding chair, one of the dining chairs from the nearest round table, the one against the left wall, which was set for 10 but currently held 8 people. Because 2 of the place cards at that table were for persons whose names, it would later become clear, had been added to the list without a corresponding invitation being issued, a common enough administrative collapse. The chair was empty and the place setting in front of it was untouched, and the people at the table were not looking at it. Elowen looked at it for approximately 4 seconds and then looked away. She did not walk toward it. She knew the architecture of these rooms, and she knew what it cost a person of her particular kind of wrong-looking to take a seat nobody had offered, and she had made a decision many years earlier about which costs she would absorb and which ones she would refuse, and walking uninvited to an empty seat in a room full of people who had already decided she did not belong was not a cost she was interested in. She stood. She was still standing when Dougray Elst, midway through his soup, looked up and saw her near the wall, and frowned in the way a man frowns when something is untidy. He leaned to his right and said something to the young man beside him, the association's program director, who looked toward Elowen with the expression of someone who has just been handed a problem and would like to return it. The program director stood and walked to the volunteer station and told Elowen, quietly but not quietly enough, that the organization was deeply sorry for the confusion, that they would of course make sure she received full credit for her registration, that a seat was available at the volunteer table, gesturing toward the folding chairs at the wall, and that the association hoped she would stay and enjoy the evening. He had a name tag that said Holt. He was earnest. He was also 31, and had never been in a room where the power he represented was the kind that stayed in your blood whether or not you were carrying it. Elowen looked at him for a moment and then said, simply, that she appreciated it. Holt went back to his table. Elowen remained where she was. Across the room, at the head table, Corvin Aldgate set down his soup spoon. At the tables between the wall and the head table, various people continued eating. A woman in a silver dress watched Elowen for a moment, then found her bread roll more interesting. A man in a military blazer looked toward the volunteer station and then looked at his phone. A woman across from him turned slightly in her chair so that her back was at a more complete angle to the wall. Corvin Aldgate, 32 feet away, did not look anywhere except at Elowen Marsh. And then Elowen did the thing that stopped him completely. She reached into her left coat pocket, the one she had been holding her hand in since the entrance hall, and she took out a small flat object and looked at it for one breath and put it back. It was a medal, not a service ribbon and not a distinction pin. The specific and irreducible shape of something a person carries, not because they expect to present it, but because it is the only physical evidence remaining that a particular set of events happened at all. Corvin Aldgate saw it for less than 2 seconds. His jaw tightened. He knew exactly what he had seen. If you have ever carried something like that, something you do not show anyone but cannot leave behind, drop "I was there" in the comments right now. Because the reason Elowen Marsh was carrying that medal to a dinner where nobody had saved her a seat has everything to do with a debt that was never paid to a person who was no longer there to collect it. Elowen had served for 11 years and 8 months. She had deployed 3 times from a reserve unit out of this same city, and she had come home each time looking largely the same as when she left, which was the kind of achievement that nobody with no experience of the work could understand, and which she did not explain. She had been a medic, not a combat medic in the way the word gets used by people who have seen the movies, a 38 whiskey, a healthcare specialist, a person who understood the particular grammar of keeping other people alive under conditions designed to kill everyone. She had worked in forward positions in 2 of her 3 deployments, and she had worked in the aid station in the 3rd. And the distinction between those environments was the kind of distinction that only matters if you have been in both of them, which Elowen had, and which most of the people in the Halstead Grand Ballroom had not. She had left the service at 31, which was the age her daughter would have been if her daughter had lived past the 3rd day. The daughter's name was Saren. Saren had been born in March of the year Elowen returned from her 2nd deployment, small and early and with a constellation of complications that the neonatal team at the hospital addressed with the full weight of their training and their equipment and their accumulated years of care, and it had not been enough. Elowen had been at Saren's side for 3 days and 17 hours, and then there was nothing more to be at the side of. The man who had been Saren's father was someone Elowen had stopped counting on the year before, for reasons that do not require listing, and so she had sat in a hospital chair in a private room with a window facing a parking structure, and she had processed this alone, which was not what she would have chosen, and was what she had, and she had processed it the way she processed everything, which was completely and without delegating any of it. She had gone back to the unit 7 weeks later. She had requested and completed her 3rd deployment. She had come home and she had filed her separation paperwork, and she had not requested an extension, and she had not re-entered the system. She was done with it. What she was not done with was Saren. The medal in her coat pocket was a meritorious service award, and it was not hers. It had been issued posthumously to a medic named Devlin Cruz, who had been Elowen's trainee, and then her colleague, and then the closest thing she had to a person who understood her, and who had died in the 2nd deployment, not from enemy action, but from a vehicle accident on a transfer route, the kind of death that does not have the dignity of a cause, and that the bureaucracy processes as efficiently as any other fatality, which is to say, slowly, incompletely, and with paperwork. Devlin's family lived in Halstead County. His mother, Rosa Cruz, had come to Elowen 3 months ago, in August, and had handed her the medal in a kitchen on the city's north side, and had asked her if she would take it to the dinner in November, because Rosa was 70 and did not do well in crowds, and because someone from the family should be in that room. Elowen had taken the medal because Rosa had asked, and because Devlin Cruz's name should have been said aloud in that room a long time before now, and because she was constitutionally incapable of refusing the specific request of a woman who had lost her son. She had not known that she would be standing at a volunteer station against the wall with a foam cup when she got there. Rosa Cruz did not know that either. Corvin Aldgate excused himself from the head table at 7:42, before the main course arrived, and he walked the length of the ballroom to the left wall. He did not walk quickly. He was the kind of man who moved at the same pace in every room, because his pace was calibrated to his actual purpose rather than to his audience, and his purpose was specific. He stopped 3 feet from Elowen Marsh, and he said her name, not a question. He had confirmed the name in the entrance hall when she had given it to the man with the clipboard, and he had been placing it since. She looked at him and waited. He said his name, full name, rank, retired. He said that he had served in a joint command with the 2nd Medical Brigade in the region where she had been stationed in her 2nd deployment. He said that her name had appeared in documentation he had reviewed in 2013, and that he had been meaning to find her, and that he had not managed to find her, and that he understood now why that was. He said this last part without sentimentality. Elowen looked at him for 3 seconds, and then she said that she had not made it particularly easy to find. He said that was not her job. He looked at the left pocket of her coat and looked away. He said, "Who was the medic?" She said, "Devlin Cruz." Corvin Aldgate was quiet for a moment, and then he said the name again, slowly, as if he was writing it somewhere inside himself. He said he had reviewed the report. He said the report had not said enough. He said, "Tell me what the report did not say." And he said it in the tone of a person making a request rather than an inquiry, and the distinction was real, and Elwyn heard it. They stood near the volunteer table for the next 14 minutes while the room around them moved through its program, and Elwyn told him the parts that did not fit in reports, which were the parts about the specific quality of Devlin Cruz as a person who worked under pressure, the particular way he learned and retained and applied, the rate at which he had become someone she would trust beside her anywhere, and the fact that he had been 26 when he died, and that 26 was not old enough to have been there long enough for the people outside that unit to understand what they had lost when they lost him. She did not cry. The narration does not say she was close to it. There is no useful information in that. She spoke in the flat, careful way of a person who has rehearsed this account many times in private, and is now saying it to someone who is qualified to hear it, and who is listening with the particular attention of someone who knows what the words cost. Corvin Aldgate listened the whole time without interrupting, and without the expression of a man performing sympathy, which was the expression Elwyn was accustomed to. And when she finished, he said that he wanted to ask her something, and she said she was listening. He asked if she was aware that the documentation from her second deployment had been referred for a commendation review in 2014, and that the review had stalled in transfer when the reviewing officer rotated out, and that to his knowledge the referral was still open. She looked at him. She said she was not aware of that. He said he had thought she might not be. He said he was going to look into it in the morning. He was not promising her anything. He was stating an intention, the way people state intentions when they mean them. The evening's program broke between the main course and dessert for a 10-minute acknowledgement portion during which individuals were asked to stand to be recognized. And during this portion, Holt, the program director, consulted briefly with Corvin Aldgate, who had returned to the head table, and then consulted with Dougray Elst, and then consulted once more with Corvin Aldgate, and then went back to his seat with the expression of a person who has been told that the thing he was about to do had already been decided for him. Corvin Aldgate stood. He thanked the organization, briefly and without performing the gratitude. He acknowledged the formal recognized veterans at the event by name in alphabetical order, and there were 11 of them, and he read every name fully and correctly. Then he said there was one additional name he wanted to add to that list. He said, Staff Sergeant Elwyn Marsh, 11 years and 8 months of service, 3 deployments, medical specialist, 2nd Medical Brigade. He said her name the way it should have been said when she walked in the door, complete and without apology. He looked toward the left wall. The room looked toward the left wall. Elwyn was standing exactly where she had been standing for the past 90 minutes, and she did not sit down and she did not step forward. And when Corvin Aldgate added, looking directly at her, that she was carrying something tonight that belonged to this room, she reached into her left pocket and she held the medal up once, flat in her palm, for 3 seconds, and then she put it back. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a speech. The room was very quiet. Dougray Elst started to applaud, and the room followed him, because that was what the room knew how to do. And when Holt, the program director, appeared beside Elwyn 40 seconds later and said that he had spoken to the venue and that a seat had been arranged for her at any table she preferred, she thanked him and said she was fine where she was, and this was not stubbornness. It was the particular refusal of a person who understood the difference between being accommodated and being welcomed, and had made her peace with which one was on offer. Dougray Elst came to her at the end of the night. He was a man who had been agreed with for long enough that the experience of being wrong had become academic. And when he found himself beside Elowen near the coat check with his organization's program director hovering 6 feet behind him, he had the expression of a person reconstructing his own behavior from the outside. He said he owed her an apology for the registration failure and for the experience she had had at the door and at the table. He said it plainly, without decorating it. Elowen said she appreciated it and that she hoped the coordination process would be looked at before next year. He said it would be. The apology was not warm, and it was not accepted with warmth, and neither of those things made it less real. Thea Sutherland, the lieutenant colonel who had been seated next to Corvin Aldgate at the head table, found Elowen as the room was clearing, and gave her a card and said that the Veterans Transition Program had a small memorial reading series that honored service members who had not received full recognition, and that if Elowen was willing, she would like to arrange for Devlin Cruz's name to be included in its next edition, which would be archived permanently in the university library. Elowen looked at the card for a moment. She said she would need to speak to Rosa Cruz first. Thea said of course. Elowen said she thought Rosa would say yes. The commendation review that Corvin Aldgate had said he would look into in the morning took 4 months and 11 days to complete, because that is how long these things take, and Elowen had been through enough of the system to know the timeline before she was told it. In March, a letter arrived at Dara's apartment, forwarded once from Elowen's previous address. It was on official letterhead, dense with procedural language, and it confirmed that the commendation referral opened in 2014 had been reviewed and approved, and that the relevant documentation would be corrected in her service record. The letter was 3 pages. The actual sentence that mattered was 1 sentence, 17 words. Elowen read it at the kitchen table while Theo ate cereal across from her and asked her what it said. She told him it was a letter about work from a long time ago. He asked if it was good work. She told him yes. He went back to his cereal. Devlin Cruz's name entered the university library's memorial archive in April, read aloud at a gathering of 23 people in a room on the campus's east side, and Rosa Cruz sat in the front row and did not speak, but held a photograph on her lap and nodded once when the name was read. Elowen sat 2 rows behind her. She had not told Rosa about the letter. There would be time for that, and the evening belonged to Devlin. The program at the archive gathering listed the service members by name and branch and years served, and beneath Devlin Cruz's entry, at Elowen's request, was the sentence, "Trained by Staff Sergeant Elowen Marsh, who knew exactly what he was worth." 5 months after the dinner, Elowen took a position with the hospital system's Reserve Medical Coordination Unit, part-time at first and then full, a job that required a clearance she already held and skills she had been carrying with her since the age of 22, applied to a structure that had not known she was available, because she had not been particularly easy to find, and she had stopped trying to make herself easier. Theo turned 6 in July. He asked Elowen at his birthday party if she had ever been in the Army, because his friend at school had a grandfather in the Army, and the grandfather had a uniform. She said she had. He asked if she had a uniform. She said she had had one. He asked where it was. She thought about that for a moment. She said she had put it somewhere safe. He accepted this and moved on to cake, because he was 6 and there was cake. A new staff coordinator started at the medical unit in September, 24 years old, fresh out of a 4-year commitment with the reserve, confident and uncertain in the specific ratio of those 2 things that belongs to people who have done something real and are not yet sure what it means outside the context where they did it. Her name was Eanes. On her 3rd week, she heard something about the previous November, the veterans' dinner, the seat against the wall, the name read from the head table, the medal held up in a palm, and she came to Elowen's desk before the end of a Tuesday and said she had heard the story and asked if it was true. Elowen looked at her. She said, "More or less." Enos asked what had actually happened. Elowen said, "I went to a dinner. A general said a name. I held something up and put it away." Enos waited for the rest. There was no rest. Elowen went back to the document she had been reading. Enos stood there for another moment and then said, "Whose name did he say?" Elowen said, "Mine, but I was there for someone else's." She did not explain further. She did not need to. Some debts are paid quietly, in rooms where no one holds a seat for you, to people who can no longer hear you say the thing you came to say, and the paying of them is the whole point, and the credit is beside the point. And Elowen Marsh had always known the difference between those two things. If this story reminded you of someone who carried something without being asked to carry it, someone who did not make themselves easy to find, leave a thought in the comments and subscribe, because this channel keeps those stories, the ones written in letters and held in pockets and read years late in kitchens. There are more of them. We will keep telling them. The letter Elowen wrote to Rosa Cruz that October took her 4 evenings to finish. Not because she did not know what to say, but because she knew too precisely, and the precision kept requiring revision, each draft arriving at the same facts by a slightly different route, until she found the route that was honest without being a burden. She wrote by hand at the kitchen table after Theo was asleep, and Dara sat nearby reading or not reading, and did not ask what the letter was about, because Dara had known Elowen for 43 years and understood the difference between a silence that wanted company and a silence that wanted witness. The letter told Rosa about the dinner in the plainest possible terms. It told her about the seat at the wall and the foam cup of coffee, and the 14 minutes near the volunteer table, and Corvin Aldgate walking the length of the ballroom. It told her that her son's name had been said in that room by a man with the rank to make saying it mean something institutional rather than personal, and that the room had been quiet when it happened, the particular quiet that a room produces when it does not know what it owes someone but has just been told. It told her about the medal held up in the palm for 3 seconds and put back. It did not tell her that Elowen had not slept well for the 2 nights following the dinner, not from distress, but from the specific restlessness of a person who has carried something for a long time and set it down briefly in public and then picked it up again and is recalibrating the weight. Rosa Cruz called 2 days after the letter arrived. She did not speak for the first several seconds of the call. Then she said thank you, in the way a person says thank you when the words are not adequate, and they know it, and they say them anyway, because there is nothing else in the language that fits. Elowen said she had been glad to go. This was true. She had not known it was true before she said it, but it clarified in the saying, the way certain things do. Rosa asked if Devlin had been treated well, meaning had his name been handled with care, meaning had the people in that room understood what they were hearing. Elowen said yes. She said it without qualification. It was close enough to true that the distinction did not serve Rosa, and Elowen had made her peace with that. The memorial reading in April had been Fia Sutherland's doing, carried out with the methodical attention of a person who files things properly and follows up on them. And Elowen had come to understand over the course of the 4 months between November and April that Fia Sutherland was the kind of institutional operator who was rare in any organization, someone who saw a gap between what was promised and what was delivered, and treated the gap as her professional problem rather than an inconvenience belonging to whoever had fallen into it. Fia had called Elowen 3 times between December and March, not to check in, but with specific updates, specific questions, specific requests for confirmation that the archive entry said what Elowen needed it to say. On the 3rd call she had mentioned, without emphasis, that Dougray Elst had stepped down from the program directorship of the Veterans Association in January, and that a new elections process was underway. She had not editorialized. She did not need to. The morning after the April memorial gathering, Elowen had driven to Rosa Cruz's house on the north side and they had sat in the same kitchen where the metal had been transferred 8 months earlier, and they had drunk coffee from the same heavy ceramic mugs, and Elowyn had shown Rosa the archive page on her phone, Devlin's name in the university's permanent record, the sentence beneath it. Rosa had read the sentence 3 times. She had not said anything. She put the phone down on the table between them and pressed her hand flat over the screen for a moment, not covering it but resting on it, and then she took her hand back and they finished their coffee, and Rosa asked about Theo, and Elowyn told her about the birthday party and the question about the uniform. Rosa smiled at the uniform question. She said that sounded like something Devlin would have asked at that age. She said he had once told her that uniforms meant you were serious about something. Elowyn thought about that on the drive back across the city. The specific and correct quality of a 20-year-old's certainty about what seriousness looks like before it becomes complicated, before it accumulates its exceptions. She had been that certain once, at that age, for those reasons. She did not regret the certainty. She did not entirely miss it either. The medal was still in her coat. It had always been Rosa's to reclaim, and Rosa had never asked for it back, and Elowyn had not offered. And at some point during the winter, it had stopped being something she reached for and started being something that was simply there, like a key to a lock she had already turned. On the first cold morning of November, exactly 1 year after the Halstead Grand Dinner, Elowyn walked the 1.4 miles from the Fennell Street parking structure to the same building and went up to the 2nd floor and into the ballroom where the 15th annual Halstead County Veterans Association dinner was setting up, 4 hours before the reception. And she placed Rosa Cruz's medal on the table where the archive display had been arranged along the room's north wall, in a small frame Fia had sourced with a card printed beside it giving Devlin Cruz's name, his dates, his unit, his rank, and the single line Elowyn had written for the April gathering. She set the frame at the center of the table. She stepped back 3 feet and looked at it. The room was empty except for the volunteers arranging chairs, and one of them, the same young man from the year before with the nervous energy, recognized her and started to say something, and then thought better of it and simply nodded. She nodded back. She put her hands in her coat pockets and found them empty, and walked back out into the morning.